they really took these people as potentially lethal adversaries, despite the fact that the number of core activists in this movement probably never exceeded 1,000. The Imperial Russian substratum and the absurdities of the Soviet way of organizing society produced this bottomless reservoir of dark humor. Among the many excellent reasons why one should learn Chinese, the Chinese have studied the Soviet collapse more closely than anybody.
To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, written by Professor Ben Nathans, won a Pulitzer in the midst of us trying to schedule this interview. It is one of the most well-sourced, deeply researched, well-written, and also funniest takes on communism that I have ever come across. It felt like reading literature and the lives and the way in which you could get into these folks' lives and their sort of quirks and personalities just brought this period of history to life more than I think any other book has for me. Today, we are joined by the legendary Ian Johnson, who has also looked into the Chinese dissident ecosystem with his recent book, Sparks. And we'll just take it from here. Ben, Ian, welcome to China Talk.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I want to start with the title. It's like the best title I've ever come across, because I guess Soviet jokes are the best things that exist in the 20th century. Where did it come from, Ben, and how'd you choose it?
First, let me say that long after all of the physical remnants of Soviet civilization have deteriorated into dust, and there's no physical traces left of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Soviet anecdotes, as they're called, anekdoti, will, I think, remain as the single best, most compact and pungent guide to what that place and time was about. So I couldn't agree with you more. And the title of the book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, I deserve no credit for. It's literally borrowed from a toast that dissidents would make, typically sitting around kitchen tables in cramped apartments in Moscow and Kyiv and Leningrad and other cities. And for me, just besides the sonic resonance of that phrase, it really captures, just with amazing efficiency, the central enigma of that movement and these people, namely their ability to be bold and despairing at the same time.
I think we should probably take it back to the death of Stalin. None of the stuff that happens in this book with all the court cases and all the personal dramas and all the legal dancing happens in a Stalinist Soviet Union, because you play around with this sort of stuff and you get shot or you go to the gulag and no one ever hears from you again, much less Amnesty International. So let's talk a little bit about that transition and why what came after Stalin decided that it needed to take a different approach than what Stalin did to discordant political tones.
Yeah. Well, I think whenever you have a system where power is highly concentrated at the apex of society and where the personality and the predilections of the ruler can be decisive, and I think, this applies in many ways to China as much as it does, or at least modern China, as much as it does to the Soviet Union. The biological transition events, which is fancy language for the death of the leader, are really important and very fraught because of the uncertainty of what comes after a figure like Stalin dies. I mean, I think it's worth remembering that the Soviet system, as we knew it and know it and study it, really was formed under Stalin. His 25 years in power from roughly 1928 to 1953, that was the period during which the fundamental characteristics of the system came into focus and were fixed, not in the sense of made better, but sort of anchored and became more or less stable. Just to speak to your question directly, I mean, the reason why things changed so fundamentally after Stalin's death in March of 1953 is that the system of state-sponsored political terror, the use of state resources to go after real or perceived enemies, was incredibly damaging to the political elite itself. I mean, the riskiest position you could occupy under Stalin was to be a high-ranking member of the Communist Party. And what was really dangerous was to be a member of the security apparatus, because so many of the people who were carrying out political terror fell into the vortex of this enormous punitive machine themselves, or they committed suicide because of the psychic stress of having to sign death warrants for so many thousands of people. So if only just as a matter of self-preservation, Stalin's successors decided, each in more or less in his own way, and at the top they were all men, that this system could not continue and it needed to somehow stabilize itself. It's interesting when you sort of look back at the 20th century and ask what leaders or what systems were most effective at killing communists. It wasn't Hitler's Germany, it was Stalin. Stalin killed way more communists than Hitler did. It's possible that Mao killed more communists than Stalin did. Ian would have to weigh in on that. But it's just worth keeping in mind what kind of sort of auto-cannibalism this system was capable of exercising.
Yeah, Ian, maybe do you want to draw the sort of parallel of how in the post-Mao era the leadership started to think about how to not have it be a complete blood sport in the sort of political system?
Yeah, the parallels and the differences are really quite striking. And of course, while I was reading the book, I kept thinking how it was similar but also different to China. I guess in China, everything was delayed until Mao died in 76. But even then, there was no real demalification in the way that there was under Khrushchev with the de-Stalinization. And I guess people say the main reason is that China, for the CCP, for the Chinese Communist Party, Mao was Lenin and Stalin rolled into one. So you couldn't get rid of Mao without calling into question the whole revolution, whereas the Soviet Union could. There were efforts in the late 70s and early 80s. There was a push to do that. And to some degree, there was a bit of demalification, but it wasn't really as sustained. So that in some ways, that structure of the system, it changed in the 80s and 90s, but the guts of the repressive system was still there. And so you ended up with something quite different, I guess, than happened in the Soviet era under Brezhnev.
I think now is maybe a nice point to introduce Vulpin, the century's most impactful autist, perhaps. What a character this guy was.
Yeah. So Alexander Vulpin was a mathematician, a Moscow-based mathematician, who ended up becoming what I describe as the intellectual godfather of the dissident movement. He was the absent-minded professor to end all absent-minded professors, someone who was famous for walking around Moscow in his house slippers, who had an extreme interest and ambition for what cybernetics could do for the world. Cybernetics being the movement unleashed by the MIT professor Norbert Wiener in the 1940s and 50s that tried to translate every known phenomenon into the language of algorithms. So it's a clear predecessor for computer science and software engineering.
Which also has an afterlife in China and is famously the kind of like intellectual superstructure for the one-child policy. But anyway, sorry, continue, Ben.
Well, yeah, Ian can enlighten us on that. I mean, it also has an afterlife in the United States where algorithmic attempts to refashion society and human life and human beings themselves, that impulse is very much alive in certain pockets of the United States today. So Vulpin was not just a mathematician, but a mathematical logician, which is to say he was interested in the nature of truth statements in mathematics and how we know that this given proof or that given proof is rigorous or not. And he also was a sort of, I wouldn't say a follower, but he was a keen student of Ludwig Wittgenstein and Wittgenstein's quest for what he called an ideal language. This goes back to the analytic philosophy movement that was centered in Oxford in the interwar period. And Wittgenstein was an Austrian Jew, but he made his way to Oxford and I would say made at least his first mark in the United Kingdom. So ideal language philosophy is built around the idea that most of our philosophical problems are actually just problems of the messiness and ambiguity of the languages that we use to think about everything. Human languages like English and Russian and Chinese are just inherently messy. They use one word to describe many different things, some of them having nothing to do with each other. So, for example, the word patient can mean the person who a doctor sees and hopefully treats. But patient can also be an adjective, meaning someone who has the capacity to wait without getting agitated. There may be some deep Latin-based etymological connection between those two, but for all intents and purposes in English, that one word performs multiple, essentially unrelated functions. And so this is an example of how human languages are just really bad for thinking clearly. And Vulpin's quest was to develop a language that would be free of those ambiguities and lack of clarity. And he obviously looked at mathematics as the kind of the gold standard for clarity and rigor when pursuing truth or trying to make statements about reality. But he, like everybody else in this movement, including Wittgenstein himself, ultimately failed to come up with an ideal language that could fulfill those criteria of clarity and rigor. But in the course of his life experience, just living in the Soviet Union under Stalin, he, like tens of millions of Soviet citizens, had a number of very nasty encounters with the police, the secret police, the punitive apparatus, and in his case, with the practice of sending certain inconvenient people to psychiatric institutions against their will. So he had run-ins with the law in the Soviet Union that were, really kind of traumatic and very difficult for him to process. But in the course of spending time in prison and in exile in Central Asia, specifically in Karaganda, the exile community in Kazakhstan, he had a lot of time on his hands. And one of the things that he spent doing was reading the Soviet Constitution and the Soviet Code of Criminal Procedure. And what he discovered there, much to his surprise, was a kind of parallel attempt at an ideal language, which is what most legal systems aspire to. They want to map out as clearly as possible what you are allowed to do, what you must do, and what you are forbidden to do. These are the three moral categories. And so, having failed, along with everybody else, to produce an actual algorithmic ideal language, he realized that Soviet law was a kind of plan B for this quest. And he gradually developed this approach that if the Soviet government could be held to its own laws, which he thought were actually pretty good, the civil liberties that were enshrined in the Soviet Constitution and the various procedural norms that were encoded in the Code of Criminal Procedure, if the Soviet government would just observe its own laws, things would be a lot better. And this became the sort of disarmingly simple grand strategy of this movement, which was just make the government honor its own laws. We're not out to change the government. We're not out to topple the government. We're certainly not out to seize power ourselves. I mean, it's impossible for me to imagine someone like Vulpin running anything just because of how abstract and literal his thinking was. He was not a social creature, really. But this quest for the rule of law in a society that had gone through some of the worst episodes of lawlessness and state-sponsored terror, this became the master plan for the movement.
So, Ian, from a personality perspective, strategic perspective, what echoes did you see in the Vulpin story to what you covered in China?
Well, I think that interestingly, you mentioned in your book, Ben, that this was picked up by other Soviet satellite states, especially like in Eastern Europe, but it was also picked up in the 90s by the Chinese rights defense movement, the Weiqian movement. So this idea, we're going to hold the government to its laws. We're not trying to overthrow anything. You can't say we're subversive or anti or counter-revolutionary were just, which they didn't use that term at that point, but you couldn't say we're trying to head, state subversion as a new law. And they tried to hold them to that. And they had a lot of this whole rights defense movement, lawyers, human rights lawyers who followed this strategy. And it was successful for about 15 years or so, roughly from the late 90s to the early 2010s. And then there's the difference comes in, and we could explore that perhaps later, but I think it really has echoes to what happened in China. In fact, a lot of foreign NGOs and foreign money went into supporting this, the endless dialogues with the rule of law, with the dialogue with judges, bringing judges over for training up lawyers, having workshops, et cetera, et cetera. There was a small industry of that. And I think part of that was they had looked what it worked kind of in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet era, and thought maybe something like that could happen in China. And I think for a while it did. And there was sort of a flowering of civil society during that time. Maybe if you want to be optimistic, for about a 20-year period from sometime in the 90s to sometime in the early 2010s. But then the party just decided this is ridiculous, and they just cracked down on it in a way that the Soviet authorities didn't do.
Yeah. I mean, I'm really interested, and you're the perfect person to ask, in whether what you described is a function of Soviet-style regimes producing a specific kind of opposition movement, one which favors the rule of law, one which is essentially conservative and minimalist rather than revolutionary and innovative, or whether there were actual lines of influence, whether people were reading texts produced by the Soviet dissident movement or read coverage of it that, where we could really talk about cause and effect and not just sort of a typological repetition.
I think they were very influenced by the Czech movement. There's a film critic and activist, a very well-known public intellectual in China named Sui Weiping, and she translated a lot of things by Havel, for example. And these were all widely read. They weren't published in China, but they circulated in a Chinese version of Samizdat. So in the Soviet Union, you really had the old style of Samizdat, right, where somebody had multiple pieces, carbon paper, and really hammered through and copied it, and other people copied it. In China, because of the digital revolution, when all this took place, they simply made PDFs and emailed these things. So you could write a book or a magazine and email it to people. So yeah, I think they were influenced by the Soviet movement. I don't know whether the construction of rule of law was influenced by the Soviets. I wonder if even authoritarian states, any authoritarian state, Soviet style or not, has to rely on laws to some degree because society is too complex otherwise. You can't have everything decided by the party secretary. You have to have, on some level, at least for disputes among companies or people for minor things, you have to have some kind of a legal system. But I'm not sure. That would be sort of comparative authoritarianism, perhaps.
Smita, a friend of the pod and co-founder of Alaya Tea, has successfully lured me away this past month from Chinese to Indian tea. Smita, how is your tea so good?
Thanks, Jordan. I'm glad you're liking it. So we started Alaya Tea in 2019 because we learned that most of the large box tea brands that you purchase are actually getting their teas from layers of middlemen and brokers and auction houses in India. And they typically sit for a couple of years in warehouses before we get to drink them. And we started Alaya in 2019 because we wanted to go directly to the source, cut out a lot of those middlemen. We get our teas directly from tea estates and farms that are all regenerative organic certified. And we do multiple shipments a year. So you're getting the most fresh cup of tea. It's also only loose leaf. So we leave all of the dusty tea bags behind. And with loose leaf, you're actually getting a full leaf tea. When you brew it and you steep it, it unfolds in your cup and you get so many more of the flavors that you normally wouldn't necessarily taste in a ground bottom of the barrel tea bag. And then the last big thing is that it's plastic free. So no microplastics that are often in tea bags. You don't taste any plastic, and there's no plastic in our packaging either.
The Assam black tea in particular, I've been making milk teas out of all week, and It's been fantastic. Go to aliyat.co and use the code ChinaTalkT for free shipping.
Enjoy it.
Ben, maybe talk a little bit about going from like revolutionary justice to more boring, like justice with laws and statutes.
Yeah. I mean, that transition really applies, at least aspirationally, to the Soviet Union in the 1930s. As strange as it may sound, the Minister of Justice under Stalin, a guy named Andrei Vyshinsky, who was really the architect of the infamous show trials in Moscow, where some of the most famous and renowned old Bolsheviks, including Nikolai Bukharin, people who had been very close to Lenin and members of the party long before the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, where they appeared on witness stands and confessed to the most outlandish crimes, of spying for Great Britain, of spying for Nazi Germany, of spying for Japan, sometimes all three at the same time. I mean, once you get that detached from reality, it doesn't really matter. And of course, they had almost all been tortured or had their family members threatened, and their confessions were scripted in advance of the trials. These are the hallmarks of a show trial. But the irony is that Vyshinsky was also the person who essentially oversaw the transition away from, as you put it, revolutionary justice towards something more professional, which he called socialist legality. I mean, revolutionary justice is the idea that you don't need professionally trained lawyers, the way bourgeois societies choose to place much of the legal decision-making process in the hands of people who have degrees and pedigrees and, have passed through what are essentially elite, usually conservative educational institutions. Revolutionary justice is the idea that real justice, capital J justice, flows most profoundly and reliably from the instinct of people who are on the right side of history. That would be workers, members of the working class. So you don't need professional jurists. What you need are workers whose gut instincts about right and wrong are the most reliable, and some people have said infallible, way to decide guilt or innocence. So in the 1920s, which was the most revolutionary period of Soviet history, when all kinds of experiments were being carried out, some of them just breathtaking, others absolutely horrifying. This was the period when revolutionary justice was seen as the highest form of adjudicating issues in courts. And, everything from divorce cases to questions of political justice, sort of high and low and everything in between. But what the Bolsheviks soon learned was that revolutionary justice was really unpredictable. Workers did not always produce the results that the party leadership wanted or expected. And as in so many other arenas, by the 1930s, the Soviet leadership was retrenching in when it came to how justice should work. And they decided, it would actually be a good idea to have professionally trained judges, people who can keep in their minds certain standards of precedence and the use of evidence and what a confession should look like. The actual practice of justice was nothing like what we would call professional. I mean, these show trials were just travesties of justice according to Western standards. But we have to bear in mind, and I think Ian will probably be able to speak to this in the Chinese case, what we call a show trial, and we use that term, as a form of condescension, like this is all just pretend. This is a bullshit trial. This is not real justice being meted out. This is all scripted in advance. The Soviets called it that themselves, because that's in the процесс. But what that word really means is demonstrative trial, as in a trial among whose goals is a pedagogical goal, is to teach the population about right and wrong, and above all about the power of the state to punish guilty parties. So once we move away from the condescension that the term show trial conjures up, we're in a lot more complicated terrain now, because Western legal systems are also engaged in the business of teaching. That's why trials are public. It's not just so that the actions of the prosecution and the defense and the judges and to some extent the jury can be subject to scrutiny. It's because trials are also classrooms where certain lessons about right and wrong are broadcast and where state power is on display. So it's a lot more complicated, and it's much more interesting when you realize that Wyszynski was presiding over a transition away from so-called revolutionary justice. And it wasn't just about these farcical show trials. It was also about a Soviet version of a professional judiciary.
Yeah, the Chinese echoes are fascinating. On the one hand, you have like revolutionary justice meted out and, land reform and cultural revolution struggle sessions. And then sometimes you're dealing with malfeasance like in Gaogang in the mid 1950s behind the shadows. But of course, I mean, most famously with the Gang of Four, where Deng is like, no, we got to put these guys on TV and show everyone that we're never going back to the Cultural Revolution. And even today, like, she put the Boshi Lai. I don't think it was live streamed, but there were definitely clips of that trial that he sort of circulated for, instructive effect.
Yeah, I want to ask Ian, how successful do you think in China these overtly pedagogical, spectacular trials were? Because I think in the Soviet case in the 30s, most people believed that the defendants were guilty of the insane crimes to which they confessed.
That's a good question. I'm not sure exactly how much people believed in it, but for sure the government did similar things. They had, especially having these trials at football stadiums and that sort of thing, and having these mass trials and mass executions, and making people go to watch them. But I think there were a lot of people who wanted to go to watch them and to see them, and probably believed, I think it's a human characteristic, maybe universal, almost all cultures, that people want to believe there's got to be some truth to some statement someone makes.
Yes.
So you kind of want to believe that, well, there's smoke, there's got to be a little bit of fire there, maybe exaggerated a little bit, but it's got to be somewhat true, right? It can't be all made up. And so I think that that's probably true when you had people like Jordan mentioned Gaogang in the 50s, but other cases as well. But sometimes it elicited solidarity. I remember one of the students who put out this magazine Spark in 1960. They went to a show trial in Tianshui, or was it Lanzhou, in Gansu province in the far west. And the famous Chinese film director Hu Jie did a documentary film, and he interviewed this woman who was there. And he said, I was so moved at how upright they held themselves and how they did not concede that they were making any mistakes. And she thought it was so inspiring how they comported themselves. So I wonder if it also backfired to a little bit, small degree at least.
I mean, the trials of the dissidents in the 60s backfired to a great degree. Ironically, the government was actually much more responsible about the kinds of evidence that it introduced in these trials, and they didn't torture any of the defendants. They didn't even beat them. And it's just so weird to think that the procedurally more respectable trials were less convincing than the sort of stage-managed show trials of the 30s.
I guess the sort of split screen of 1960s Chinese Cultural Revolution stadium denunciations and executions, and then what we're about to talk about with Siniavsky and Daniel, this kind of, absurdist comedy of two writers, I think is something to keep in mind. So Ben, why don't you kind of transition us from Vulpin to this sort of literary scene, which has its completely hysterical day in court.
Yes, in both senses of the meaning of hysterical, very funny and also nuts. So Vulpin has this strategy, which he's sort of developing privately, and you can find the evolution of his thinking about the legal strategy in his diaries, which are housed in the archive of the Memorial Society in Moscow. And I worked with them when one could still do that before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Vulpin loved to write a long entry on New Year's Eve every year. He was big into sort of taking stock and taking account and not only reviewing what had happened during the previous year, but setting out goals for the next one. And in one entry, I think it was 1958 or 59, New Year's Eve, having arrived at this legal strategy, he said, in essence, I'm just waiting for the right opportunity to put this into practice. And that opportunity arrived in the fall of 1965. This is 1 year after Khrushchev has been yanked from the top position as General Secretary of the Communist Party, allegedly for mental health reasons. But the real reason was that the rest of the party elite just couldn't stand how unpredictable and erratic his policies were. So Khrushchev's been out of power for a year. Everybody's wondering, what comes next? Are we going back to Stalinism? What kind of future can we imagine for this country that has just gone through this epochal transition away from mass terror? And when these two figures, who you mentioned, Andrei Siniavsky and Smuggling, were arrested in September of 1965, it sent shockwaves through the intelligentsia because this seemed very ominous. Many people had not heard of these guys at all, and they were unaware that they had been publishing short stories and novellas and essays under pseudonyms outside the Soviet Union. That had all been completely hush-hush. And when it came to light that they had been arrested and that they were going to be charged with anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, there was a kind of a panic, like, uh-oh, this is the first sign of a return to the kind of repressive state that we knew in the 1930s and 40s under Stalin. And Vulpin decides, okay, this is an occasion not to demand the innocence of these writers, not to insist that they be released from custody, but simply to apply the demand of the rule of law to this particular case. And they were arrested in conjunction with each other because they had been operating together. They used the same person to smuggle their works abroad. And so he came up with something that had never happened in Soviet history before, probably had never happened anywhere before, and that was he organized a meeting in the name of transparency. The meeting Glasnosti. So he was using this word transparency in kind of a new way. The word itself is not new. It goes back at least to the 19th, maybe even the 18th century. And it means either transparency or publicity or openness. You know, people of a certain generation in our own time are very familiar with this word because it was one of the key words of Mikhail Gorbachev during the Glasnost, so-called Glasnost era, the era of transparency and reformation, perestroika. But Vulpin was the one who mobilized the word as a way of responding to the arrest of these two writers. And the demand of the meeting that he was going to call was very simple. An open trial for these two writers and everything in accordance with the Soviet Constitution and the Code of Criminal Procedure. Nothing more, but also nothing less. And in the book, I sort of detail how in fits and starts the planning for this Glasnost meeting, this transparency meeting, came into focus. It's an absolutely fascinating story, and in some ways, for me it was parallel to the histories that have been written about the coming into existence of the Declaration of Independence. It's a slightly grandiose analogy because the Declaration was, the launching pad for a new, not just a new country, but a new kind of political system. But people have done fantastic work on the various drafts of the Declaration of Independence, not only by Thomas Jefferson, but by other authors. And I tried in my own small way to do something similar for the sort of opening salvo in what would become the dissident movement, namely this appeal to Muscovites and others to meet on December 5th, 1965, which is the anniversary of the ratification of the Soviet Constitution, to make this very minimalist demand, open trial. And you can sort of watch Vulpin's thinking evolve in real time over the course of the fall of 1965. And even more interesting, you can watch other people enter what was originally a kind of monologue on his part, enter the conversation about this new rule of law strategy. There was enormous skepticism, not to mention just derision of this idea. Most people's initial response to Vulpin's approach was, are you nuts? Have you lost your mind? This government doesn't care about law. Why are you being so naive as to think that you can use Soviet law against the Soviet state? It's a very counterintuitive thing to take Soviet law seriously, because everyone had grown up thinking, well, maybe they believed it when they were children, but they'd grown up thinking that this is just window dressing. Why on earth would you take this seriously? You're acting like a child. And Vulpin's response to those criticisms was always, you're part of the problem. There are too many people like you who don't take law seriously and who aren't ready to hold the government accountable when it breaks the law. If there were more people like me who insisted on the literal application of the law, not only to the behavior of Soviet citizens, but to the behavior of the Soviet state, we'd all be much better off.
Let me ask you a quick question. Why, and this sort of is a question that I have while reading all this stuff, going through this, it's like, this is fascinating. Why did the government agree? Why didn't they just make these people disappear? I mean, why did they feel this need to conform? Was it because they were concerned how it would come across in the West, or was there something else going on internally?
I think it's both. First of all, this was a government not only under Khrushchev, but it turned out under his successors, who, by which I mean principally Leonid Brezhnev, who proceeded to govern for the next 20 years, they shared Khrushchev's sense, and it wasn't just Khrushchev who came to this idea, that you couldn't go back to Stalinism. It was just too lethal. And above all, it was too lethal to the party elites themselves. So everybody wanted stability. Everybody wanted predictability. And the new benchmark of success and power was no longer how are we doing compared to Tsarist Russia, say in 1913, on the eve of the First World War. That's a fixed benchmark. It's not changing over time. Under the conditions of the Cold War, the comparative framework was always how are we doing in our competition with the United States? And the United States was not set in amber. The United States was probably the most, or at least one of the most dynamic societies on the planet. And to be able to claim that the Soviet Union was getting closer and closer to generating the kind of wealth that the United States could generate, and was superior to the United States in the way it distributed that wealth, that required certain forms of predictability, of stability at the top of the system, and of the ability to satisfy the needs of the Soviet population. And that's why you have creeping consumerism in the Soviet Union starting in the 1960s. So part of why the Soviet government didn't just execute Siniavsky and Daniel is that it wanted to showcase itself now on a global stage, that it could compete and essentially outcompete its rival. But there were also internal reasons, and I think these have often been overlooked. In Stalin's time, the name of the security apparatus was the NKVD. This is the predecessor to the KGB. The KGB was the new name. There were many new names, but the longest lasting one, and the one that everybody's familiar with, if only because Vladimir Putin himself was a KGB agent, is the Committee for State Security, which is what KGB stands for. And this is the crux of what you're getting at, I think. The KGB itself very much wanted to become more professional, more modern. It wanted an image of a professional kind of intelligence service that didn't keep dungeons and torture chambers for its victims, that was fully consistent with modern governance. And that's why the kinds of trials that emerge of dissidents in the 1960s and to a lesser extent in the 1970s, you can see how the Soviet system is really trying to have modern professional trials, not show trials. They don't torture the defendants in advance. They don't hand them a script and say, this is what you're going to say. Now, it's true that the judges and the prosecution are always working together, but that's not specifically Soviet. That's the way most continental judicial systems work. It's the United States and the Anglo-American world that's the outlier, historically seen. This adversarial system is the outlier. So the Soviet Union is trying to have a professional judicial system. It wants to broadcast an image of itself around the world not just to the West, but to all of those newly decolonizing states in the developing world that face this kind of choice. There's a fork in the road. Are we going to go the American route, capitalist, multi-party systems, or are we going to go the Soviet route, a socialist economy, a planned economy, single-party rule? And one of the ways of sort of competing in that system is to show that you have a modern judiciary that has procedures that everybody can respect. So there are performative elements, but there are also internal elements that have to do with the attempt at self-professionalization by the KGB.
You have this great metaphor that you close the book on of this whole thing being a stage and actors and people are playing their parts and some people don't want to play their parts, and this sort of dance between what's real and what isn't, and how much you want to commit to the bit, I think is something that you see in tension in all of it. And I want to spend tension throughout the book, and I want to stay more on the Siniavsky and Daniel ones, because Vulpin picked a great test case. These guys played their role to the T and were on a very different script, I think, than what the prosecutors and judge were really, had any idea what they were end up going to go up against. But look, if you pick some absurdist creative fiction writers pushing the bounds of form, then maybe you should be ready for the unexpected. So let's stay on this trial for the while. It was my favorite of the ones you profile. Why did they get called in? What were the facts here?
Sure. So the facts are that for the course of nearly 10 years, these two guys were publishing works abroad using pseudonyms, and the KGB took a decade before it could figure out who the actual authors were. And it's an amazing detective story. The initial thought was, oh, these are emigres who harbor this lifelong, biographically driven grudge against the Soviet Union because it destroyed Tsarist Russia and the country that they grew up in and that they loved. So there was a hunt for emigres. And as you know from current events, when the Soviet intelligence services decide that an emigre is acting against the interests of Moscow, they're not shy about going after them no matter where they live. But they couldn't find emigres. And they also started to think that, God, whoever these guys are, they write about Soviet reality with such incredible specificity and sort of tactile familiarity. Maybe they're living inside the country because they seem to know this system from the inside out. Their humor and their satire is so on target that it's hard to believe someone who doesn't live here and know the system intimately could produce this kind of fiction. So they're looking all over, and it literally takes them 10 years before they crack this case. Meanwhile, Andrei Siniavsky had been working as a literary critic and an instructor at the Gorky Institute for World Literature. One of the most delicious ironies in this story is that in its attempt to ferret out who the real authors were, the KGB actually shared some of its classified material with the faculty of the Gorky Institute, the thinking being these guys really know literature, and maybe their stylistic analyses of these pseudonymous publications abroad can help us with this investigation. So Siniavsky was literally being consulted about his own case at one point. I can't imagine what was going through his mind when this happened. Yuli Daniel was less well known professionally. He worked mostly as a translator in his so-called day job and producing these satirical stories, which are amazing, amazing stories. I mean, just if I may be permitted a brief detour, one of Daniel's stories is called Murder Day. And it's a counterfactual kind of science fiction story about an experiment that the Bolshevik leadership runs in the early 1960s. The idea is the Bolshevik Revolution is not just about creating a more socially just society. It's not just about abolishing private property and greed and selfishness and cultivating collectivism and solidarity. Ultimately, what those things are meant to accomplish is the creation of a new kind of human being. Humanity 2.0. People who will have been born and grown up under this new system, and their characters will be different from people who grow up under capitalism. To my way of thinking, that's the most radical agenda of the Bolshevik Revolution, is to create new kinds of human beings, not just a new kind of society. So Daniel's story runs with this idea and imagines a day in the early 1960s when the government declares that murder is now legal, because it wants to find out, what do these new human beings do when there are no institutional constraints on their behavior? There's no sword hanging over their head saying, if you kill someone, you're toast. And it's just, we're going to remove that entire incentive and disincentive structure and see how people behave. Will the new Soviet person refrain from this, most heinous of crimes if left to their own devices without the threat of punishment? And the story plays that out. I mean, it's just this amazing, not just sort of thought experiment, but it's a way of thinking through the Bolshevik experiment and this question of, did it actually succeed in creating new kinds of human beings? Well, needless to say, the Soviet government didn't like this. It didn't like anybody saying anything satirical or funny about it. So Siniavsky and Daniel are eventually found out. It's a really like a whodunit detective story that involves the analysis of the typewriters that were used to disseminate their stories. It turns out the conduit to the West for their stories was none other than the daughter of the French naval attaché at the embassy in Moscow, a woman who'd formed very close friendships with both Siniavsky and Daniel and several other people, who went on to become a professor of Slavic literature in France. Hélène Peltier was her name then. She eventually married someone and took on a different name, Zamoyskaya. But this is just an amazing story of a kind of platonic love triangle, smuggling, and then eventually the whole thing unravels and these two writers are arrested. So you mentioned the trial itself. Thanks to the wives of the two defendants, particularly the wife of Yuli Daniel, a woman who had a PhD in linguistics, Larisa Bogoraz, and went on to become, I would say, a more important dissident, certainly than Daniel himself. And we can talk about her later. And we can also talk about why it's the men who became famous rather than the women in general. She and the wife of Siniavsky, a woman named Maria Razanova, as spouses were permitted to enter the courtroom. That was a small form of transparency that the state allowed. Anyway, they were able to create verbatim transcripts of the trial. And those transcripts were eventually reproduced under the technique known as Samizdat, which is just a Russian neologism that means published it myself. And what it means in reality is people with typewriters, carbon paper, and onion skin paper just multiplying like a chain letter, a text of anywhere from 1 to 500 pages. And the transcripts of these trials started to spread around the Soviet Union. They were also smuggled abroad, and they were published in all of the major European languages, as well as Japanese, I believe. And these trial transcripts
were dynamite.
They're dynamite. I mean, I think like a lot of historians, I think, Ian, you probably share this, we all want to bring our protagonists to life. We all want to create, within the realm of the factually verifiable, we want to create stories that bring the past to life. We want to do what the great historian Bill Cronin described as we carve stories out of what is true. And at some point it hit me when I was working on this book, I have dialogue that I can reproduce in my book. I don't have to make up people talking to each other. I actually have dialogue that was captured in two forms: trials, the back and forth between the prosecution and the defendants or the witnesses, and interrogation transcripts, the dialogue between the interrogator and the victim or the witness in any given case. And it's a dream come true for an historian to be able to say, and then he said, and then he said, and then she said, and it's literally something you can document. And to make it even better, I discovered when I was working at the archive of the Hoover Institution in California at Stanford that, for all these years, we've known that the two wives created this transcript of the trial. And that transcript has been read very widely. People have written about it. But always in the back of my mind was, how accurate is that transcript? I mean, okay, Larisa Bogoraz was a linguist. She was very skilled at shorthand note-taking. But we have no way of knowing whether that is a full and accurate record. And then what I found at the Hoover Archive was the KGB dossier on Andrei Siniavsky. During the early post-Soviet period, any dissident or the descendant or the spouse of a dissident had the right to request a copy of their KGB dossier. And Andrei Siniavsky did this for himself, and after he died, his widow, Maria Razanova, sold that dossier to the Hoover Institution. The stuff there is, talk about a eureka moment. Amazing material in that archive. Interrogation records from before and during the trial. But among the other things, what I found there was the government produced its own transcript of the trial. And if you look carefully at photographs during the trial, you'll see that on the defendant's dock, where Siniavsky and Daniel are sitting, are two things that look a lot like microphones. So I'm pretty sure that the KGB was making a recording of the trial. The plan was that they would release the transcript in an attempt to damn the defendants. But, they were kind of rookies at trials that weren't scripted. They were rookies at trials where the defendants hadn't been tortured in advance. And so what they got with this recording was, oops, this is a transcript that really doesn't make us look good. It makes the defendants look good. But the key point that I want to make here is that I compared the official transcript, which had never been released, with the one that was created by the wives of the defendant. And lo and behold, the transcript that circulated in Samizdat and eventually in the West was about 95% accurate. It was extremely close to a transcript that was made from what I am convinced was a tape recording. And in some cases, the unofficial transcript was more accurate because it recorded the audience reaction. So there are moments where it says stormy applause or grumbling in the audience. So
It's like stage direction.
exactly, it's just like you are there text. I mean, I can't make up anything better than this transcript. It's just like the interrogation transcripts. I can't do better than that.
I think we owe it to them to do a little reading session. So my two favorite excerpts from this is The Interrogator. The majority of your works contain slanderous fabrications that defame the Soviet state and socialist system. Explain what led you to write such works and illegally send them abroad. Siniavsky. I don't consider my works to be slanderous or anti-Soviet. What led me to write them were artistic challenges and interests, as well as certain literary problems that troubled me. In my works, I resorted to the supernatural and the fantastic. I portrayed people who were experiencing various maniacal conditions and sometimes people with ill psyches. I made broad use of devices such as the grotesque, comic absurdities, illogic, bold experiments of language. Interrogator. In this session, and in the collection published under the title of Fantastic Stories, the Soviet Union is described as a society based on force, as an artificial system imposed on the people in which spiritual freedom is impossible. Is it really possible to call such works fantastic? I don't agree with this evaluation of my works. And it's just brilliant because he's getting the interrogator to say that actually what he's saying is true, and the Soviet Union, is this crappy place to live.
Yes. There are so many layers going on here, but I want to say something that it pushes back a little bit against what you said earlier. The purpose of Siniavsky's and Daniel's self-defense, and they're just amazingly eloquent when they're on the stand, was to make the case for the autonomy of the literary imagination, was to say that literature is outside the sphere of ideology, politics, and also the law. That is very different from what Vulpin wanted to make out of this trial. So if the two writers in the docket were trying to assert the freedom of the literary imagination, in other words, to defend the vocation of the writer of fiction, what Vulpin wanted to show was how the government couldn't put together a consistent legal case, and how important it was for the details of this trial to be made known to the public. And even though Vulpin was not the one who arranged for the codification and dissemination of the unofficial transcript, the people who did do that came up with a very clever strategy, which was the trial lasted 3 days, roughly. And what they did was they punctuated the unofficial transcript with coverage in the Soviet press. So you'd have day one of the trial, here's what was said verbatim by the judge, witness, defendants, prosecutor, whatever. And then here's what the Soviet press said about the trial for all of you, tens of millions of Soviet citizens who couldn't be there. And when you saw this juxtaposition and how warped and skewed and tendentious the Soviet media coverage was, the effect was devastating. Anybody who read this could only conclude that the media was Soviet media was a completely unreliable reporter on what had actually happened in this trial. So it was a devastating document in its time.
So this is the judge. You wrote directly about the Soviet government, not about ancient Babylon, but about a specific government, complaining that it announced a public murder day. You even named the date, August 10th, 1960 run. Is that a device or outright slander? I'll take your example. If Ivanova were to write that Sidorova literally flies around on a broomstick and turns herself into an animal, that would be a literary device, not slander. I chose a deliberately fantastic situation. This is a literary device. Danielle, are you trying to deny that Public Murder Day, supposedly announced by the Soviet government, is in fact slander? I consider slander to be something that, at least in theory, you could make other people believe.
Yes. So if you find it credible, you're an enemy of the Soviet state. But if you recognize it as fantastical, like I do, then you're not. Brilliant argument. Absolutely brilliant.
So this sort of tactic of making the system risible, are there parallels in the Chinese context that come to mind?
Most of the cases, I don't think so. People like Liu Xiaobo, we don't really have a lot of the trial information from them. But I think in some ways, the avant-garde artists in the 1990s, they were trying to achieve that with some of their art. But I don't think there's anything quite the same as what happened here, which made me very envious because I kept thinking, God, these are such colorful characters and there's such a richness of data that you have because of the archives being open, at least for a certain amount of time, enough time to get the stuff out of it in a way that hasn't happened with China. Maybe we'll see stuff like that in the future happen, but I don't know about right now.
As always with humor, it's a seriously interesting subject. Why things are funny, what makes them funny, what context allows these things to be perceived as funny. I think, the question for me is, was it the absurdity of the Soviet system that generated so much dark humor? And I just want to be clear, Jordan. First of all, I'm delighted that you picked up on the funny parts of the book because it would be tragic if that got missed. But I just want to be clear, it's not only dissidents that made jokes about the government and the Soviet system. This was pervasive. This was a very widespread coping mechanism and also meaning-generated mechanism. And, I could rattle off any number of Soviet anecdotes that have nothing to do with dissent per se, but are sort of meant to capture the absurdity of some aspects of life in that system. So my favorite one is, first learn to swim, then we'll fill the pool with water. This captures the sort of out of syncness of so much of the patterns of life in that country. And I must admit, when I tell these jokes to my students at Penn, the result is usually a sea of blank faces. And as you know, the minute you explain a joke, you have executed that joke, and it is without any, frisson or energy whatsoever. So these are culturally specific jokes, but what they capture is just so profound and so deep, including the dissidents. And I don't know enough about Chinese culture to say, but there's some combination of the sort of predecessor to the Soviet Union, namely the Imperial Russian substratum, and the absurdities of the Soviet way of organizing society that produced this kind of just bottomless reservoir of dark humor. It really is the thing that I think will abide after the rest of all the other traces of that civilization are gone. The humor will still be there.
I mean, I think there's just like this aspect of earnestness that you see in the Chinese post-imperial, well, I guess pre and post-imperial political tradition, where I don't know. Maybe this is a ChatGPT query. I'll try to find like the funniest stuff written by Chinese people about Chinese politics. But yeah, it's not really like a. None of these dissidents today are particularly funny, I think, in the Chinese context.
Yeah, I mean, Chinese people, of course, are funny and they love to tell jokes and stuff like that. But there's this term in Chinese, 忧国忧民, like worrying about the nation and worrying about the people. That you're essentially a Confucian official and you're concerned about the country and concerned about people, and therefore it's your duty to do this, as opposed to this kind of scallywag, ne'er-do-well kind of aspect that comes out a little bit in the Soviet era. So
yeah, this like holy fool idea is not really something. Well, you kind of have like Taoist holy fools, but the Taoist holy fools aren't there to like make fun of the emperor. They're just there to be like drunk and
we're making fun of life and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably worth noting that when the Soviet dissident movement was covered in real time, above all by Western journalists, they've almost never mentioned humor. People like Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn were not perceived as having any sense of humor. It's only when you start digging below the surface, and especially into the memoirs and the diaries and the letters and other less well-known sources, that you realize there is this substratum of coping through humor and satire. And it's very deep, very, very deep.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think when journalists, they're trying to sell the story, they're trying to sell it as a big, serious story about people standing up to authority, and humor or something like that doesn't fit into that narrative as well.
So let's take it back to this incredible trial of these authors. How does anyone end up hearing about it? How does this get disseminated?
Sure. Well, the two wives, as I mentioned, of the defendants produce their own unofficial transcript. They do this day in and day out over the course of the trial. And eventually it becomes part of a kind of anthology of documents: the transcript of the trial, coverage by the Soviet press, letters from various observers. And it circulates through this technique known as Samizdat, which is just a Russian neologism that means I published it myself. The implication being I never could have published this in any of the state-sponsored publishing houses where everything has to pass through the censor's office. The technique is, almost unbelievably simple. All you need is a typewriter, very thin, preferably onion skin paper, and carbon paper. And you create a stack of alternating onion skin and carbon paper. It could be, 3 deep, 5 deep. Some people said it could be as much as 10 or 12 deep. You wind it around the platen in your typewriter, and you pound on the keys so that when you're typing, you're actually making 3 or 5 or 10 copies of the document. One of the typists said that, by the time you finish typing a novel on Samizdat, you've got shoulders like a lumberjack. You're just pounding the keys. And then it disseminates the way a chain letter disseminates. So you give one copy of this text to someone, and that's essentially a kind of gift. You're saying to that person, I'm allowing you to read this uncensored text, which is technically illegal, although there's kind of a gray zone there, and could get you into trouble. And in return for the favor of granting you access to this forbidden fruit, you yourself have to create multiple copies of it and distribute it again to people who you trust. So yes, it seems very primitive, but a couple of things were happening around Samizdat that made it much more efficient than it might first appear. One is that Samizdat texts were often, not always, but often smuggled abroad. And a certain proportion of those smuggled texts were taken up by publishing houses in the West and either translated and published for Western readers or translated by an emigre press in Russian or Ukrainian or Lithuanian or whatever indigenous Soviet language they'd been composed in. And typically they would be published in small pocket-sized editions and smuggled back into the Soviet Union in a technique known as tamizdat, which means published over there. I just happen to have an example that I purchased years ago of this little book. It's a handbook for dissidents or anybody who thinks they might be called in for an interrogation by the KGB. It's by yet another mathematician named Vladimir Albrecht, and it's called How to Be a Witness. And it's literally a manual for what do you do? What do you say? What do you not say? How do you say it if you get hauled in by the KGB in a trial? Fantastic book, well worth reading now. And in fact, it has been reproduced on the internet in Russian now for protesters starting in 2011, who also were getting hauled in, this time by the KGB's successor, the FSB. Okay, so Samizdat augments the very limited republic of letters that Samizdat manages to create. Far more powerful was when those smuggled Samizdat texts ended up in the research divisions of the shortwave radio stations, whose task it was to broadcast to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. By that I mean Voice of America, which Donald Trump is in the process of obliterating, Radio Free Europe, the BBC, the Deutsche Welle, Kol Israel. Many, many foreign countries broadcast on shortwave wavelengths things that we would now call audiobooks. So if you got it in Samizdat, it would look like a homemade book held together maybe by a paper clip or some other fairly crude technology. And the number of people who were in these networks of Samizdat is in the tens of thousands. I can say that with some confidence because the KGB did my research for me in this case. As you can imagine, there was no institution in the world that was more interested in the dissident movement and in what it was doing and producing than the KGB. And the KGB did an incredibly thorough, wide-ranging investigation of the most popular underground Samizdat periodical, the so-called Chronicle of Current Events. And what the KGB investigation showed was that in every medium to large size Soviet city, from Moscow to Vladivostok, across 11 time zones, you could get Samizdat. And they compiled lists of tens of thousands of people who were part of these distribution networks. They were either creating Samizdat or distributing Samizdat or just reading Samizdat. So that's already a more significant number of people. And if you take the number of people who were listening to Samizdat in what they called Radizdat, which is short for radio publishing, that's a reference to the shortwave radio stations, then we're talking about millions, probably tens of millions. There I do not have good numbers. I don't know that we'll ever be able to calculate, short of a Nielsen poll, that we'll ever be able to calculate the number of Soviet listeners to Samizdat broadcasts, courtesy of the BBC and Voice of America. But the anecdotal evidence from diaries and memoirs is just overwhelming that this was a very widespread phenomenon all across the Soviet Union. So these distribution networks start looking a little less backward and inefficient than they might at first glance. And then the last thing I'll just say briefly on this topic is that a while ago, let's say between 2000 and 2010, in the heyday of the internet, when all kinds of utopian aspirations were being read into the internet and what it would do in terms of creating a globally transparent information society, people like to say, oh, the internet is the Samizdat of the 21st century. It leaves Samizdat in the dust because now we're talking about billions of people able to communicate below the radar screen with unmediated contact to each other. Isn't that wonderful? Well, it turns out that in some ways Samizdat was far superior to the internet. And the most obvious way is that Samizdat was an ownerless technology. Nobody owned it. There was no platform that belonged to Meta or to Google or to anybody else. It was literally ownerless. And that meant, among other things, that you couldn't disrupt and control Samizdat. And trust me, the KGB tried many times. You couldn't disrupt it or own it or censor it the way you can with the internet. And in that respect, while it may be technologically backward, it was far more effective as a medium for true freedom of expression.
I want to read my two favorite paragraphs of your writing in the book that kind of describe the experience of what it was like to be a Samizdat reader and creator. So you write, Samizdat provided not just new things to read, but new modes of reading. There was binge reading, staying up all night pouring through a sheath of onion skin papers because you've been given 24 hours to consume a novel that Volodya was expecting the next day. And because, quite apart from Volodya's expectations, you didn't want that particular novel in your apartment any longer than necessary. There was slow motion reading for the privilege of access to a Samizdat text. You might be obliged to return not just the original, but multiple copies to the lender. That meant reading while simultaneously pounding out a fresh version of the text on a typewriter, as a thick raft of onion skin sheets alternating with carbon paper slowly round its way around the platen, line by line, 3, 6, or as many as 12 deep. Your shoulders would hurt like a lumberjack's, recalled one typist. Experienced Samizdat readers claimed to be able to tell how many layers had been between any given sheet in the typewriter's ink ribbon. There was group reading. For text whose supply could not keep up with demand, friends would gather and form an assembly line around a kitchen table, passing each successive page from reader to reader, something impossible to do with the book. And there was site-specific reading. Certain texts were simply too valuable, fragile, or dangerous to be lent out. To read Trotsky, you went to this person's apartment. To read Orwell, to that person's. However and wherever it was read, Samizdat delivered the added frisson of the forbidden. Its shabby appearance, frayed edges, wrinkles, ink smudges, and traces of human sweat only accentuated this authenticity. Samizdat turned reading into an act of transgression, having liberated themselves from the Aesopian language of writers who continues to struggle with internal and external censors. Samizdat readers could imagine themselves belonging to the world's edgiest and most secretive book club. Who were the other members who had held the very same onion skin sheets you are now holding? How many retyping separated you from the author? Thank you, Ben.
My pleasure.
I think that really shows what a lot of people say when they talk about civil movements or civic movements, that it's smaller groups that are bound together in some way that have a much more lasting impact. And the problem with social media is it's good at creating a straw fire, like let's all go out to protest and against, take down Wall Street or whatever. But then 2 months later, how many people are still with you? And after somebody gets arrested, who's with you? And immediately people drop away. But people, I think, who are bound in this collective act, they're much more likely to have some kind of an impact.
It was scary, but it was also fun and exciting and cool. And they're all hanging out together and drinking till like 5 o'clock in the morning. And it's just, it was a lifestyle in a way in which, just like being on Twitter and posting is not. And I think it's, because there was this sort of thrill of the chase and excitement. Ben, just like take us into this world of the people who are entranced by this stuff and kind of made it into their lives.
Yeah. And I mean, to the list of qualities that you just mentioned, I would add something that I think was essential to this movement from start to finish, which was the intense adult friendships that kept these face-to-face communities together and the kinds of trust and loyalty that those friendships entailed. I mean, those are meaningful things in any setting, but they are especially meaningful in a setting like the post-Stalinist Soviet Union, where the level of public or social trust was really catastrophically low. People were just so afraid of informers and people who might denounce them, whether they're neighbors or their coworkers, that the counterpart of these little islands of trust and friendship among men and women in these groups, the counterpart to that was a high degree of suspicion, but also cynicism about society as a whole. And I think those are legacies that are still at play in Russia today. And they were certainly enabling for the dissident movement, because to engage in these kinds of activities, which could get you arrested, could prevent your children from ever getting into a university, you really had to trust the people that you worked with, whether it was on drafting a document or taking part in a demonstration or simply housing and disseminating Samizdat texts. So yeah, those are really important qualities. And I think the intensity of friendship and trust within the movement had a dark side, which was it made the movement rather elitist. It made the participants skeptical of people that they didn't know. One of Vulpin's criteria for success for these demonstrations was always, did I see people there that I don't know? Because he wanted that. He recognized that to become an actual social movement, you needed to move beyond these circles defined by friendship and intimacy. But that was easier said than done. And for many people, the suspicion of strangers never went away. And so they really preferred, as Ian was saying, to work in small groups with a lot of mutual knowledge and the ability to work together creatively.
It's interesting because on the one hand, yeah, like unless you can sort of have the chain of the chain reaction as someone started talking about, like really like hit an exponential, it's hard to have real chains. But on the other hand, for a lot of these people, like what triggered them down this path was the KGB putting them into a position where they had to start incriminating their friends. And that was sort of the like ethical fork in the road that, you know, most people ended up going left, but a handful of folks who really became the core of this movement, of the thousands or so folks who put their names on things, that was the thing that really brought them to a moment of truth about how they were going to relate to the regime.
Yes. It's what I call, and I borrow this from Andrei Siniavsky himself, the stumbling block, the sort of moral stumbling block that so many people encountered. It could take many, many different forms. You know, for someone at the elite level of the system like Andrei Sakharov, this really great physicist who was the architect of some of the Soviet Union's most lethal nuclear weapons, for him, the stumbling block was when he realized that he was going to have no say about how those weapons were used, including how they were tested and the environmental damage that resulted from the above ground testing of nuclear weapons. But for many people, it was more like what you described, where they're brought into the KGB in whatever city they live in, and they're told that they are going to become informants for the KGB, and they're going to have to tell the KGB in whatever weekly or monthly meetings what their friends are up to. For some people, that was just such an ethical crisis for them that they couldn't live with themselves if they adopted that role. And so and yet they were loyal citizens. They'd been brought up to respect the KGB as the protector of the revolution. And so these created crisis moments. And, you know, I think most people ended up making their peace with the system, adjusting to it. But for certain very high-minded Soviet citizens, that was morally impossible. And those are the people who sometimes found their way to the movement.
We were comparing it to the Chinese context. It's like, yes, or the Stalinist context, you're not getting shot, but this is not costless. And there's lots of examples in your book of people losing their jobs, people being sent away from their kids, not being able to care for elder relatives. It's still a very aggressive step to take, even though the KGB is not going to take you behind the shed.
Yes. I mean, all of those things that you mentioned, they're terrible. They disrupt lives, they ruin lives. But to really assess their historic significance, you have to see them in comparison with the kind of punishments that were meted out under Stalin. And under Stalin, the people who populate my book, the dissidents, they would have been shot. They would have been shot in dungeons in the KGB headquarters in Moscow and in the various provincial headquarters, or they would have been sent to the Gulag for hard labor for up to 25 years. So, you know, the last thing I want to do is whitewash the punitive system under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, but it's a sea change from what preceded it. And that was noticed by the dissidents themselves. I mean, Siniavsky writes about his interrogation based on his own father's experience that he was expecting to be beaten and possibly tortured. And instead, he describes the KGB agents who interrogated him as astonishingly polite.
Well, let's talk about someone who had some Gulag stripes, Grigorenko. I think there's a really interesting parallel with the line he takes, because a fair number of folks in China as well have this, like, you know, redder than red justification for their issues with the regime.
Yeah. Well, I think in both cases, and Ian, you should weigh in here, in both cases, early on in the history of these regimes, the typical worldview of someone who became a protester or a dissident, whatever you want to call them, was Marxism-Leninism. You know, it was the idea that not so much that the regime wasn't abiding by its own laws, it's that the regime had somehow jumped the tracks and was no longer living up to the ideals of the revolution. This, after all, was Mao's great criticism of the Soviet Union after Stalin, was that it had somehow slipped into a very pernicious form of revisionism, and that Khrushchev, under the guise of de-Stalinization, was actually turning the Soviet Union into a reactionary bourgeois country, and that therefore it was incumbent upon Mao and China to take up the banner that Lenin had led and to become the vanguard of the world socialist revolution. Similarly, domestic opposition in the Soviet Union in the 1940s and 50s generally advocated a return to Leninism, as they put it, a return to Marxism and Leninism. And it's when that ideological worldview starts to run out of gas, starts to lose its energy and its mobilizing capacity, that's when a space is opened up for a new approach. And that new approach is the legalist philosophy, which is much more minimalist. It's not about toppling the regime. It's certainly not about any kind of revolution. Vulpin and other rights defenders had, basically had it up to here with revolutions and the violence that they brought with them. They were looking for incremental, fully law-abiding change. So someone like Grigorenko was a convinced Leninist. It's only very late in life, after he has played out his part in the dissident movement and has been forced to leave the country and settled in New York, only then does he really adopt a new worldview, and that's the worldview of Christianity, and give up the Leninism that he had advocated for most of his professional life, both in the army and as an important member of the dissident movement.
Just from the Chinese perspective, you mentioned the role of Marxism, Leninism. A lot of the people would always talk about reading or ransacking the collected works of Marx and Engels for the footnotes, because that was their way of finding out more about Western philosophy and outside ideas. So it was inspiring to them as well, but I guess in a different way.
Somebody should do a history of the various modes of reading Marx, Lenin, and Mao. It's a particularly good group of authors to do such a study for, because their works were produced in mass state-subsidized editions of tens of millions. And that means that we have an unusually large readership. The work of the historian will be to recapture the nature of those readings and the receptions of those works. Because any work that has even a minimal level of complexity lends itself to different ways of reading and misreading, or creative misreading. So this would be a fantastic case study of texts that were read by millions, maybe billions of people. And they're a touchstone for how people read, what they make of a given text in any given time and place.
Yeah. Makes you kind of feel for Xi printing all those books and no one reading them. I do want to do a little bit of reading from some of the Grigorenko transcripts. I think this is the prosecutor saying, "We're not here to lead a theoretical discussion. You created an underground organization whose goal was to topple the Soviet government. Fighting against that is the task of the organs of the state security, not of party commissions." "That's an exaggeration," he responded. "I didn't create an organization with the aim of violently overthrowing the existing order. I created an organization for the dissemination of undistorted Leninism, for the unmasking of its falsifiers." The prosecutor: "If it was only a matter of propagating Leninism, why were you hiding in the underground? Preach within the system of party political education and its meanings." His response: "You know better than I that that's impossible. The fact that Leninism has to be preached from the underground demonstrates better than anything that the current party leadership has deviated from Leninist positions and thereby lost the right to leadership of the party, and has given to communist Leninists the right to struggle against that leadership."
Bravo.
These guys are great. They're just the best.
This also, I just want to emphasize, Grigorenko is a major general. That's his rank in the Soviet army. When people talk about dissidents as coming from the fringes of society, I always bring up Grigorenko, because he is as embedded in that society and as much a product of its educational system as anybody you can imagine. This is, I hope, one of the deep themes of the book that emerges over time. It's that orthodoxies produce their own heresies. It's impossible to imagine a person like Grigorenko existing in any society other than that of the Soviet Union. He's a poster child for Soviet values. So these people are the products of their own system. They're very Soviet in a way, but they're repurposing the cognitive categories and the moral ideals in directions that the state had not.
And I think, in a lot of the more recent protests in China as well, you have this critique from the left as much as it from like, you know, a small L liberal right, that the contemporary Chinese government is not living up to the ideals of socialism as defined in a different way than she would.
Yeah, that's why I think when looking at these people, also in the Chinese context, similarly, it's a mistake to think of them as just coming from the fringes, that there are people firmly embedded inside the system, as they say in Chinese, 体制内, inside the system, who are critics and who write these things. So certainly in the Mao era, but even now, these are people who often have access to more information and have a better idea of the way the system works. So they become that much stronger and more effective critics. Well, one thing I noticed in reading the book is that the Soviet leadership seemed more sensitive to the West than I would expect in a Chinese context. In the Chinese context, maybe in the 90s when they're trying to get into the World Trade Organization and a few things like that, people paid a lot of attention to what Western governments said. But the Soviet leadership seemed a lot more concerned about how they were perceived in Western countries. Is that accurate? And how much of a role did that play in the leeway that these people got in your book?
It's accurate, and it was an extremely significant fact, this sensitivity to Western opinion. This came home to me in a moment during my research that I didn't include in the book, but I'll just share it with you now. Among the many genres of documents that I drew on are transcripts of Politburo conversations. And during the time when the post-Soviet Russian Federation was a little bit more open to researchers, you could get your hands on quite a few transcripts of Politburo conversations, including conversations about human rights and dissidents and Western criticism. So anyway, there's this one moment where Leonid Brezhnev is on kind of a rant about Western coverage of Soviet policy. And he starts to cite a critical article from the Baltimore Sun. Now, I'm a native of Baltimore. I was born there and I grew up there. And Baltimore Sun's a great newspaper. It's probably a second or third tier newspaper in the American hierarchy of papers, you know, clearly less important and influential than the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Miami Herald or the LA Times. And I'm thinking, okay, just take a deep breath here and realize that the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, one of two superpowers in the world, is getting upset by an article that was published in the Baltimore Sun. Has there ever been an American president who could even name a Soviet newspaper other than Pravda and Izvestia? I seriously doubt it. And this brought home to me the just extraordinary prickliness of Soviet leaders when it came to Western criticism. And when you ask yourself, okay, why is that? Why does Brezhnev even care what the Baltimore Sun is saying about him or his government? I think it's a really important clue. It's a clue to the idea that the Soviet Union saw itself as coming out of the same Enlightenment modernizing tradition as Western countries. It didn't see itself as civilizationally different or superior. It saw Marxism, Leninism, and socialism generally as civilizationally superior to capitalism. But the point is that the story that they are operating within is a succession story. You know, it's like Christianity emerging from Judaism or any of the other stories of religious evolution over time. So to Soviet leaders, it really did matter what people in the West thought, not just because they were competing with Western societies and attempting to outdo them, but they saw themselves as essentially genetically emerging from those societies. And therefore, it was just unacceptable to be described as inferior or having lost their way in this historical trajectory that begins with the French Revolution and the revolutions of 1848 and all the things that formed the traditions of socialism and social democracy. Again, Ian would know much more about this than I do, but having read a little bit in the debates about Asian particularism when it came to defending Asian countries against charges of human rights violations, and the idea that, well, human rights are a Western cultural code, and they're not really, the individualism that is so embedded in human rights thinking is not appropriate for societies in which the family and the collective is the preeminent unit. The Soviet leaders never took that defense. the way the leaders of, say, Singapore or China have been known to do. They saw themselves as having a superior set of human rights norms than that of the West. They had outdone the West at its own game. So I think this is a really crucial difference, and I think it remains true today, although the contrast is not as sharp, because I think Putin and his entourage just are so fed up with criticism from the West that they just don't care anymore. And they no longer defend their values on a continuum that includes the West. Now the talk is of the Russian world, of sort of Russia as a civilization unto itself. That way of thinking, I think, is much older and much more familiar to the Chinese.
Yeah, that's right. The Chinese definitely only, I think, in a tactical way, respond to criticisms of human rights. They will respond to it and come up with their own white papers, for example, on human rights problems in the United States, but almost as a way of snubbing their nose at the US and saying, you think we have problems, you've got equally big problems. And they never signed up to something like the Helsinki Accords or something like that, where they committed to certain benchmarks or standards. So they just don't care as much, I think, about what the West says. And I think it also goes to the big differences in reading these things and seeing the groundswell of support. You had deep-seated economic problems in the Soviet Union, which bit by bit, but pretty quickly after the Mao era ended, were lifted in China. So you didn't have as much grassroots support, and that sort of goes to something you say in the conclusion about Mommsen and the German historian talking about criticism in the Nazi era of critics without a people, or critics without...
Resistance without the people.
Resistance without the people. So in some ways, China's success in the economic reforms, in a way that Gorbachev didn't succeed in doing, undercut a lot of the support that dissidents might have had in China compared to what they had in the Soviet.
Yeah, that's super important. I mean, if you ask yourself what was the single greatest, most resonant achievement of the Soviet state across its entire history, I think everyone from that country will tell you the defeat of Nazism in World War II. That was the shining moment. And if you listen to Putin talk, he just reinforces that point, that it's the defeat of Nazi Germany in the Second World War, this epic struggle that cost the Soviet Union roughly 25 million lives. The problem with having a peak performance like that is that it's fixed in time and it's constantly receding in time from the current generation. The Chinese government's greatest achievement is having lifted 700 million people out of poverty, and it is continuing to provide a form of material well-being that, it's the gift that keeps on giving. It's not stuck in time. It's not an event that ended in 1945, the way the so-called Great Patriotic War ended. So as a source of not just legitimacy, but prestige, the Chinese government has a product that is much, much more effective than the Soviet government or today's Russian government has.
The theme of prestige is something that has come up on past episodes of China Talk. We did a 4-hour two-parter on the new To Run the World book. Yeah, Ben, just the level of embarrassment, like the Politburo has 40 meetings talking about what they're going to do with Sakharov. It is remarkable to me how sort of worried they are about these people making funny jokes at them and, just pointing out to the rest of the world that they're a society where the emperor doesn't have any clothes on.
Yeah, it's something that I continue to struggle to understand. I mean, on the one hand, there was a tremendous degree of self-confidence. The Soviet Union won the war. The Soviet Union launched the first human into space. The Soviet Union was the largest country on Earth, feared and respected by everyone. The Soviet Union was no longer alone in the socialist camp. It had a series of allies in Eastern Europe and was gaining more in Asia and in Africa. It even had Cuba in the Western Hemisphere. There were so many markers of success and achievement. I'm not even mentioning the Soviet performance in certain elite pursuits like chess and physics and math and ballet and poetry and literature. In terms of high culture, the benchmarks were all there. They were checking the boxes. And yet, as you say, these seeming symptoms of insecurity that are wholly out of proportion with the threat give you the feeling that there's some kind of subterranean anxiety that they just can't shake. I mean, Henry Kissinger famously said during détente, that if a kiosk in Moscow could sell the New York Times or the Washington Post, in other words, break through the information monopoly of the Soviet state, it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't make any difference. And evidently, the Politburo thought otherwise. They thought that they could not afford any disruption of their control over what information Soviet citizens had access to. And that's why they tried to jam the Western shortwave radio broadcast. That's why they punished dissidents. That's why they performed thousands, maybe tens of thousands of apartment searches in this completely quixotic attempt to literally destroy all Samizdat, which is impossible. You can't do it because it's a completely decentralized system of textual production. You just can't control it. And the KGB failed miserably. And I don't have a good answer for this. And I wish I could sort of get inside the minds of people like Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB and briefly the head of the Communist Party after Brezhnev, sort of how did he weigh security and insecurity? And did he really see these individuals like Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov and other dissidents as representing potentially mortal threats to the Soviet system? I mean, the amount of man hours and anxiety that were spent on Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, is just mind-boggling. And they really took these texts and these people as potentially lethal adversaries. Despite the fact that, as you mentioned earlier, the number of core activists in this movement probably never exceeded about 1,000. And this in a society, a population of 250 million people. So I had to ask myself, how did this tiny band of dissidents come to appear so threatening to the regime? And part of the answer is there was this underlying, unacknowledged current of anxiety about the sustainability of the Soviet Union. But there was also this sense that these dissidents were actually the puppets of Western intelligence services. And while they might look like a tiny band of intellectuals and misfits, they had the CIA and MI6 and other security services behind them, and therefore they were worth taking seriously as a threat to the Soviet system. But there's some mystery here that I have not been able to solve.
There's a corollary to that if they took it all so seriously, Xi Jinping in a speech bemoaned the fall of the Soviet Union, and he said, at the end of the day, no one was man enough to stand up and save it. And essentially, why didn't somebody send in the tanks, or why did they just let the whole thing sort of collapse? And on the one hand, they take all this so seriously, but at the end of the day, they seem also maybe paralyzed by the same fear or the anxiety that you're talking about, and they just can't do anything about it.
It's a great question. I mean, it's one of the enigmas of the Soviet collapse. How does a superpower that's armed to the teeth and that has overcome the most lethal attack in human history, namely Operation Barbarossa, unleashed by Hitler in June of 1942, how does that system manage to collapse like a house of cards? I'm sorry, I misspoke. June of 1941, June 22nd, 1941. How does a system like that just collapse like a house of cards? I am inclined to think that it's not so much the fear and anxiety, but what can help explain the really, you put your finger on it, the thing that's most surprising is why was there so little resistance by the people who stood to lose the most from that collapse, namely the political elites? Why were the stakeholders in the Soviet system not more aggressive, proactive, and frankly violent, or ready to use violence in their defense of the system? So here I think there are two parts to the answer. One is Gorbachev, who had orchestrated the reforms that ended up unintentionally unraveling the system. Gorbachev was such a perfect Leninist and had mastered and internalized the language of restoring the ideals of the Bolshevik Revolution and of Leninism to such a great extent that his conservative rivals inside the party bureaucracy and the apparatus of the state, they couldn't find a discourse separate from Gorbachev's to oppose him. He essentially co-opted the language of Leninism and of socialist idealism in a way that made it very hard for Soviet conservatives and system defenders to outmaneuver him. And it took them actually a long time, relatively speaking, to understand that Gorbachev, while he sounded like the ultimate poster child for Soviet values and the Soviet system, was actually going to undermine it by trying to fix it and reform it. There's that famous phrase from Alexis de Tocqueville: the most dangerous moment for an authoritarian regime is when it embarks on a campaign of reform. That's when everything can go haywire. The other reason why I think the Soviet elites did not, to use she words, stand up like a man and defend their interests and the system that had raised them and that they allegedly stood for, is that the dissidents had helped hollow out the legitimacy of that system. That was not really the dissidents' goal. I mean, remember, their goal was to disseminate legal consciousness among their fellow citizens and to get the Soviet state to be more law-abiding. They failed on both of those fronts. If anything, the KGB became less law-abiding as it grew more and more frustrated with the fallout from these various dissident trials. They always got the guilty verdict. Everybody was sentenced to 5 or 6 or 7 years, and that's because the KGB got on the phone with the lawyer before the trial began and dictated the outcome. But the political fallout of these trials was a disaster. The government looked clumsy, ham-fisted, authoritarian, secretive, and it was all of those things. So the unintended effect, but possibly the most important effect, historically speaking, of the dissident movement was that it hollowed out the legitimacy of the regime. It showed over and over again that this Soviet state, which advertised itself 24/7 to the world as the avant-garde of human history, as the most modern, forward-looking society that had ever existed on planet Earth, that this system could not even obey its own laws and was constantly improvising and subverting its own legal system. It was impossible to reconcile those two things. This image as the vanguard of human history, but also an essentially lawless government. And that, I think, undermined people's gut loyalty to the system. It made them question the system's own rhetoric about itself. And also, by the time you get to the 1980s, this is a system that's been around for 70-some years. Revolutionary energy, like all energy, is subject to entropy. It dissipates over time. And what we're dealing with by the 1960s and 70s is what I call second-generation socialism. It doesn't have the fervor and the sort of bloodlust and the convictions that go along with revolutionary fervor of the original generation of Bolsheviks. So among the many excellent reasons why one should learn Chinese, if you're an historian of the Soviet Union, it's that the Chinese have studied the Soviet collapse, I think, more closely than anybody, because they perceive it as being the most important historical episode for them to master. God forbid that China should fall apart the way the Soviet Union did. And I would love to be able to read what Chinese historians have written about the Soviet collapse, because the lessons that they draw, I think, are really important for the way the current Chinese government understands what it is, what it must avoid, and what it must do. And my understanding from, secondhand accounts is that the dominant Chinese interpretation of the Soviet collapse interprets that collapse as a function of a loss of ideological vigor and of ideological commitment. And I think they really believe that, and I think that is one of the reasons why Xi is absolutely determined to constantly buttress ideological commitment to the party, to the nation, to the state. This is a hugely important example of the way countries extract historical lessons from other countries' experience.
It's interesting thinking about this though in the context of the time that you guys you're writing about then, because the amount of content, the degree in which you can live your life in China today, like removed from the state and just like not having the state really be in your way and something you focused on, is something that is fundamentally different than the Soviet experience. I mean, obviously in the 30s and 40s, but through the 60s, 70s, and 80s as well, because you're not stuck listening to state media all the time. You can read whatever book you want, pretty much. You can even get on the Western internet for the most part and just like, watch Mr. Beast, or Mr. Beast even is on Billy. I mean, it's just like the sort of extent to which the Soviet state and the hypocrisies that made your life worse than it had to be were thrown in your face in the sort of second half of the USSR is so fundamentally different. So on the one hand, you have this kind of contemporary CCP survival strategy of like, yeah, we'll make people like richer and richer over time, and we'll just make it so they never have to think about politics. But there's an aspect of that which is like, I think, disappointing a little bit for someone like she, who was, forged was forged in the Cultural Revolution and comes out kind of really believing in the party and the mission, and to have everyone sort of tune out to all of that is also isn't particularly satisfying, and maybe not necessarily something you want to bank on for the long term. So you also have this attempt, sometimes ham-fisted, sometimes a little more effective, of trying to lace in this ideology and, college classes and the Gaokao and whatnot. Ian, any thoughts on this tension of like tuning out versus tuning in trying to bolster the party?
Is it true that you can look at anything, pretty much anything you want to on the Chinese internet without fear of repercussions?
Well, a lot of things are blocked, but it's still, you can live, if you don't ask too many questions about society around you, you can live a very full life, and you often feel that you're getting almost everything. If you've studied abroad, you might say, gee, I wish I could access Facebook or something like that. But most people, there's a parallel universe of Chinese social media apps, which are perfectly adequate. People are by and large prosperous, they can travel. And so while they may have some desires for a little bit more knowledge, but even if you want to know about the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, there's a government account of that. So if you've heard about this, you can go online, you can go to Baidu, you can see, which is like their Wikipedia. They've got an entry for it. It's not like it's all been erased. It shows that there were some chaotic people in China and they caused an uproar. The government had to come in, and then they have pictures of government tanks that were burned out, which was accurate. These are accurate photos. And then if you see the picture of Tank Man, that's said, yeah, Tank Man, it shows the government didn't run over people. There's a guy standing in front of a bunch of tanks. The tank's trying to get around him. And he's, so it's like there's a whole, they hire a lot of people to construct this kind of matrix-like alternative universe. So if you're really hell-bent and you want to dig really deeply, you can get a VPN and you can jump over the firewall and you can see what's going on. But most people, like in any country, right, they're not that political. And if tomorrow's a better day, I think that's pretty much okay for 90% of the population.
Yeah. I mean, that description is not too far from how I would describe the lives of many Soviet people in the 1970s, minus the economic prosperity. But that sense of being able to carve out a life for yourself that is essentially outside the constant ideological mobilization by the state, and thinking that you had access to a lot of things by shortwave radio. Of course, there was no internet at that time, but plenty of people had access to foreign literature. And as you said, the majority of people in almost any society don't particularly want to be politically engaged. That was certainly true in the Soviet period. And I believe it's true in the Russian Federation today, where I think for the vast majority of people, politics means getting yourself dirty. It means you're contaminating yourself morally. And therefore, most people don't want to have anything to do with it.
We had talked about earlier how this was primarily a male-dominated area. But there were very important women involved as well, including many of the famous people who put together the Samizdat publications. But what was the role there, do you think? Because I know in the earlier dissident movement in China, especially after Tiananmen, it's often criticized for being very male dominated, with big male egos clashing and creating organizations and stuff that fight more against each other than against the state. Whereas in more recent years, and maybe the only enduring civil society structures against the state now in China are feminist movements, and that women working together seem to be able to get more things done than men. Now, I don't mean to essentialize or idealize things, but I wonder what it was like in the Soviet era, because it seems like we have these big names and they're all men. And why was that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There's the question of sort of who actually did what, and were there unspoken gender roles in a movement that, at least on the surface, resisted any kind of formal division of labor and formal hierarchy or leadership. In that sense, there was a strong anarchistic strain within the movement, the idea being that, people should protest according to what their consciences told them to do. But if you look at the history of who made the big programmatic statements, who articulated the legalist philosophy, and who started coming up with policy recommendations for the Soviet government when that started happening in the 1970s, that activity skews heavily towards males. And we could talk, at length about the actual roles that people played. A vast majority of people who typed Samizdat, retyped it, were women. The programmatic statements, as I said, mostly written, composed by male figures. But there's a different layer on which you have to sort of pose this question, because the movement was partly shaped by the way it was covered by the Western media. The Western media was such a powerful bridge to a truly receptive audience, namely Western publics and Western governments, in contrast to the absence of any kind of dialogue with the Soviet state and with most of the Soviet population. Since the Western media was so crucial to that, the way the media covered the dissident movement and its individual figures ended up having an impact on the movement itself. And what the Western media did was what the Western media almost always does, which was it plucked out a handful of individuals for an enormous amount of attention and a very bright spotlight. So it made household names out of people like Andrei Sakharov, Andrei Solzhenitsyn, Natan Sharansky. Now, I don't mean to take away from those individuals at all. They were extremely impressive. Sakharov was a world-class physicist, Solzhenitsyn arguably one of the most important writers of the 20th century. And I don't mean to belittle the Western journalists. I mean, let's face it, in the 1960s and 70s, being the Moscow correspondent of your newspaper meant, you were certainly among the foreign corps, you were kind of at the top. You were being stationed at the epicenter of the Cold War enemy. These were very talented people, but they were almost all male, almost without exception, whether it was from the Times, the Post, Le Monde, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, you name it. These were all male correspondents, and they brought with them a certain set of unspoken expectations about who was a credible leader of a movement like this. And they seem to have assumed from the outset, as did the KGB, that the only people who could possibly be credible leaders were men. And it's interesting when you look at Western coverage, they'll refer to someone called Mrs. Sakharov. Now, Mrs. Sakharov would have been known in her own country as Yelena Bonner. And they refer to someone as Mrs. Siniavsky. Mrs. Siniavsky would have been known as Maria Razanova, just like Mrs. Daniel was known as Larisa Bogoraz. I'm mentioning these examples because the naming practices are emblematic of certain assumptions about gender roles. Larisa Bogoraz was far more important to the dissident movement across its history than her husband and then ex-husband, Yuli Daniel. And Yelena Bonner, I wouldn't say she was more important than Sakharov, but her way of being in the movement and what she contributed to it was totally different and independent of what Sakharov was about. She was a different kind of human being entirely. He was shy and retiring and absorbed with physics problems, and she was a firebrand and someone, who just would not take no for an answer. So the Western coverage, which did so much to put the movement on the map globally, was also a filter system. And it highlighted the importance of some people, almost all male, and it made invisible a whole bunch of other people. That's why the subtitle of my book is The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, because, with all of the deserved respect for Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn, both Nobel laureates, they didn't create the movement, they didn't lead the movement, and in many ways, while they were very important, they were not the people who really propelled it forward. And I wanted to highlight those other lives that have been largely forgotten, both in the West and in today's Russia. Just as a footnote, that the sort of second meaning of the subtitle, there's a bit of a play on words there, the many lives of the Soviet dissident movement, refers to the fact that the movement went through several near-death experiences when it was almost crushed and annihilated by the KGB. And each time it had to reinvent itself and reformat itself in order to take up the banner of the rule of law in a new way and in a new mode, until the last time when it actually was crushed, really pretty much finally in 1982.
Since publishing this, has any weird stuff come out of the woodwork of people reaching out with different documents?
There have been some readers who have contacted me to say either, oh, I knew so-and-so, or why didn't you mention so-and-so? For me, the most unexpected response is a function of the fact that I finished the book in the summer of 23 and it came out in the summer of 24. And then Donald Trump won the election in November of 24. And, I came to this project wanting to understand how people who live in authoritarian societies construe their options for public engagement with the issues of the day. And I was thinking, well, I'm trained in Russian and Soviet history, so that'll be my case study. But obviously this should have some interest for people who study China and Iran and North Korea and other authoritarian societies. And then the election happened, and people started to read the book as a guide to being a dissident in the United States in the year 2025. And asking themselves, well, what would a rule of law platform look like under an administration that seems determined to, to put it mildly, bend the law over and over again, or abuse the law, or outright break the law? So the American resonance of the story is something I just did not anticipate. And it's just come up again and again and again.
It's funny because I almost read it the opposite way, where, look, I am nominally a public person. I have a podcast and a newsletter that a lot of people read. I can say whatever the hell I want, and pretty much nothing's going to happen. I'm sort of reflecting on the characters in Ian's book and in your book, and the challenge and the risk that they're going up against, and just like the levels of seriousness of a decision to go up against the regime. It's like, look, like half of you have 60 million Americans who voted for an opposition figure to Trump, right?
Yeah.
We have elections that happen every few months, these special elections, mayor elections. I mean, it's just like, I'm sorry, guys. You are not Soviet dissidents out there. We still very much have a system and a rule of law. And look, I'm not to say that I am in favor of Trump advance trimming around the edges of it, but my takeaway was this is really apples and oranges here. And I think from a sort of strategic lessons perspective, as well as a look, don't get too high on your own supply and thinking you're really lying on the cross when you get to challenge these people in courts and elections and win. It almost comes off to me as offensive to the memory and the efforts that these people have made and are making in Russia and China today.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's totally fair. And that, as you say, the level of risk and what's on the line in engaging in dissenting activities is just totally different in the two settings. But when you think about if you believe, say, that the courts and the free press are the most important sources of institutional, call it what you want, resistance, balance, containment of this very aggressive executive branch, that kind of resonates with the dissident story, right? Samizdat is their version of a free press, and the various trials are their forms of testing the Soviet judiciary. But yeah, I mean, obviously they are probably more striking and greater than the similarities. But who would have thought that the similarities would even be as striking as they are?
Well, the biggest difference is, it's not just the courts and the press, it's power. Like, there is no universe in which Vulpin gets elected to the Politburo. You have a Senate, and there's like 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats. And the Republicans, by the way, can barely pass any laws. And there's going to be election 18 months from now. And that's not going to happen. And I think the aspect of this being hopeless and this being this uncomprehensible, enormous monolith that you really have to be kind of a crazy person, or just, have such sort of deep-seated, almost holy conviction in trying to live truthfully and freely to even imagine a world in which this changes, is the sort of thing the dissidents have to do. All you have to do in America is start campaigning for an election that's going to happen, 14 months from now. It's just, I don't know. It doesn't do it for me, but it is, I think it's remarkable and maybe more reflective of everyone in America wanting to see themselves as heroes to draw their parallels between these folks and them today.
Yeah, that could be. I mean, what I had hoped would be the takeaway for American readers who were inclining in that direction would be that if the Soviet dissidents could operate under a system and a set of circumstances that was many orders of magnitude more hopeless than ours, then no one in this country has the right to give up hope. Because we have so many more grounds for optimism and confidence that the system will withstand a stress test. That would be a very, I think, healthy takeaway from this story. But as you know, people read things the way they want to read them.
Is there a movie or a mini series or some sort of dramatization that you would really like to come out of this? I mean, I really think just picking one or two of these trials and turning that into a feature film would be something really special.
Various documentaries have been made about the dissident movement by Russians, including Vladimir Karamurza, one of the guys who was exchanged in the prisoner exchange last summer, who is very knowledgeable about the dissident movement and has interviewed many of the former dissidents. I don't know of a dramatization. People have talked, and there is a director who's toying with the idea of doing a biopic about Andrei Sakharov. I think it's easier to organize a script around an individual than around my book, which has so many individuals. It's just dozens and dozens. But if someone were to undertake that, I would, of course, be delighted. I just hope that it would be someone who can really capture the texture of life in the Soviet Union and not Hollywoodize it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can set it just around one of these trials. I mean, the two novelists, it's this stuff is gold. We didn't talk a lot about Albrecht, but what a character. I mean, you have the dialogue there already. It's
yes. Yep. Sometimes when I was writing, I just felt like I just need to do justice to my sources because they're already so fantastic.
Cool. All right. Well, yeah, Hollywood agents, reach out. Maybe once the AI tools get good enough, I'll use them to produce this movie, Ben. 2 quotes for us to close on, just to kind of focus back on these people and what their experience was of all of this. Dramolga said in a court hearing, this is one of the people that signed on to the August 1986 public demonstration that happened after the Czech invasion. We haven't even talked about the sort of international Soviet foreign policy dimensions of how they kept restarting this movement. This person said, "All my conscious life, I have wanted to be a citizen. That is, a person who proudly and calmly speaks his mind. For 10 minutes, I was a citizen." And a line from Sakharov saying, "It is essential that we get to know ourselves better. Soviet society had started out on a path of self-cleansing from the foulness of Stalinism. Drop by drop, we are squeezing the slave out of ourselves." And the sort of purification and the ennoblement, I think, of these people that they brought both to themselves, to their peers, and then to the world is one of the things that's going to stick with me for a long time that I got out of this book.
It's going to stick with me too.
This is really one of them where, look, we just did a 2-hour podcast. I feel like we've only scratched the surface. The details and drama and overall narrative arc of this book is really, really special. And every time I get something of this quality in the sort of subject matter that fits right in China Talk's lane of Leninist history, communist history, it just brings a big smile to my face. So I could not recommend this book more. Ben, thank you so much. For more Chinese context, check out Ian's awesome book, Sparks, and all his other ones, Souls of China, one of my personal favorites as well. We close on a song. Ben, is there like a song or two that you feel like, I don't know, inspired by or captures the essence of the Samizdat movement?
Yes. Unfortunately, the dissident movement had a kind of soundtrack, and that was the music that was being produced by the so-called bards. These were singers, men and women, who would sing just accompanied by their own guitar, often not so well tuned, but that was kind of deliberate, like Samizdat, rough around the edges, lots of sweat and dirt. And they were really poets. These were poems set to music. And one of my favorite of these singers and songwriters, he was also an actor, was a guy named Vladimir Vysotsky, sometimes called the Bob Dylan of the Soviet Union. And he has a song called Hunting After Wolves, where he talks about the instinct of wolves to face up to the people who are trying to kill them. And it's been read, among other things, as a metaphor of the dissident movement, that wolves cannot do otherwise than their nature dictates. And dissidents were people who simply couldn't live with a version of themselves that did not stand up and speak out against the injustice that they saw. You can find it on YouTube. In Russian, it's called Охота на волков, the hunt for wolves.
Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being a part of China Talk.
Thank you, guys. And it's so obvious that you read this book with great care and attention, and I'm really grateful for that. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks, Jordan, for letting me be on the podcast too. It was a great privilege and a lot of fun.